Section 3, Chapter 5. After I settled into my daily routine, I got used to sleeping and waking up behind locked doors, but it took more time to get used to the seesaw intensity of the place. When life was funny in prison, it was hysterically funny, and when it was scary, it was menacing. The trick was to observe everything and every person without becoming the object of anyone's negative attention. The effort to become invisible, to appear non-threatening yet dangerous, was exhausting. Which is why in prison almost everyone wanted drugs. Not books, not journals, not pens, not anything that would make you more aware of your pain. They wanted drugs to smoke, drugs to snort, drugs to swallow, and drugs to shoot directly into their veins. By any means possible, if you took enough, you could forget what the side of your fence you were on. You could jail your own fears and drift away with the clouds. Drugs were smuggled in by family members and spouses every Sunday. The altar boys collected them in the offering baskets and funneled them through the church office. Food service workers brought them in and sold them into the cafeteria crews, who in turn had friends or relatives mail them to the payments. Drugs were hidden in tennis balls, painted grass green, and thrown over the double rows of the 12-foot fences in exercise yards. They were carried in by trustees on work release or who wore boots and hollowed out soles and traveled into town and back. Construction workers who came in to build dormitories and were talked into making deals. Hallucinogens were mailed in on the drug-laced stationery. Even a few crooked guards brought them in. You could get anything you wanted for a price, from cocaine and heroin to reefer and full-range pills to take you up or down. I could always smell reefer while I was out in the yard, and every now and again I'd see someone nodding off in the cafeteria. About once a week we had some kind of pill overdose or drug-related emergency at the hospital, often involving homemade works. Once a man stumbled up the clinic with a metal needle used to inflate basketballs shoved into the crook of his arm. He had taped the clear tube of a ballpoint pen to the threaded end of the needle, and on top of that he had fixed a tennis ball. He told me he cooked the dope, poured it into the pen tube, jammed the sharpened point in the needle into his arm, attached a tennis ball, and gave it a good squeeze. The air pressure was supposed to drive the dope down in the needle and into the vein, only it didn't work out that way. He over-squeezed the tennis ball, and the air rushed down the tube, through the needle, and directly into his vein, and by the time I saw him, he had a quivering ball of air trapped in the vein over his bicep. Fortunately, he had a belt wrapped tightly around his upper arm, and cutting his circulation, he would be dead from an embolism. I was in duty and squeezed the air back down his vein toward the puncture in his elbow. It hissed and sprayed blood as it came out, and I kneaded his arm over and over until it couldn't feel any more bubbles. "You ready?" I asked, hoping there wasn't a bubble left that might lodge in his brain. He nodded, and I unsnapped the tourniquet. He whimpered and a quick prayer, then sat there still as a statue until he figured the danger had passed. Then he unrolled his sleeve and dashed off down the corridor before any hospital guards saw him. While I was in the hospital cell, I stayed away from the drugs. I wanted to escape into them, especially Valium and Librium, which were little pleasure pillows that I knew would dissolve my massive stress, if only for an evening. They were always for sale, but I didn't dare to cop. I was too afraid of being caught, and I figured getting out of prison was more important than getting high in prison. Because the hospital cells were off limits to the general population, we had a number of traveling prisoners stay with us. Mostly they were men from the Witness Protection Program who were in organized crime who had snitched their way somewhere else. They'd stay for a few days until U.S. Marshal arrived to take them to secret destinations. We also warehoused the men in a rape charge until they were sent to prison and sexual offender camps. One day I woke up to find a different kind of visitor. He was Elvis impersonator. When I asked him his name, he replied without hesitation, "Elvis Presley." "Nice to meet you, Elvis," I said. He was on tour traveling from prison to prison to put on shows while working down a 5-year sentence for mail fraud, selling fake Elvis memorabilia through the magazine. I found him absolutely incredible. He looked like the young Elvis in rolled up blue jeans and denim shirt. His hair was dyed perfectly blue-black, and he practiced singing while holding a guitar with no strings. A guitar string was considered a potential weapon for garroting people, and he was only given his strings just before a concert and then had to give them back. His a cappella voice was very true, though. It was wonderful to hear him practice blue suede shoes. Heartbreak Hotel and In the Ghetto. As I went in the hospital, orderly business of changing bandages, taking vital signs, and filling out charts. He gave a concert to the gym. I never attended because a fistfight broke out between hecklers and hillbillies, and I was busy in the x-ray room taking shots of broken knuckles and metacarpals. He was gone the next day. We had one female employee in the hospital. She was the administrator's assistant. We called her Miss Kentucky, and as she was shapely and rolled her hips when she walked in. Okay, I'm going to summarize this. Long story short, they take an x-ray of her, and you could see her chest, and then someone stole it and then used it as, like, sexy pictures, and then she felt so violated that she quit. Next, there was a guy from Baltimore who came up to x-ray room to see me. He wanted a laxative. I told him to wait in the regular triage for a physical assistant. I was busy screening the new admissions for venereal diseases, and he didn't want a laxative. He admitted he really wanted an x-ray. That was against the rules, and I asked him why he wanted one, and a week ago he said his wife visited during the course in the visit and slipped him a dose of Vaseline coated balloons full of hash, which he swallowed, and he hadn't gone through the toilet since. Then he was feeling sluggish. "You gotta help me," he pleaded. "I can't go to the doctor. I'll get busted." I had him come back in an hour after I finished my work. I put him in front of the fluorescent without his shirt. I didn't like using it because it leaked a lot of radiation. I wore a lead apron and flipped the switch. "Move your gut around like a hula dancer," I said. He did, and I spotted the trained balloons in his lower intestines. They looked whole, but impossible to tell for certain. "You need an enema," I said. "How do I do that?" "Go down to the cafeteria and lift one of the ketchup squeeze bottles in a pointy top. Clean it out good and fill it with hot water and do what has to be done." I give him a single serving packet of KY jelly from the supply closet. "Put this on the tip first," I said. Next day he returned with glazed eyes and a smile. He slipped a gram of hash in an upper pocket. "Thanks, man," he said. I nodded, and as soon as he left, I traded it to the kid in the lab next to mine who did all the blood counts. He gave me a pair of surgical scissors, which I used for clipping pictures out of magazines. After 5 months, I went to see the parole board. I was very tense because they were going to determine how much of the 60 days to 6 years I would have to serve. I'd already served 150 days, so I thought I could advance the argument that I had done enough time and was ready to go home. 3 parole judges had made up the board. There was nothing I could do to prepare except to practice my physical and facial gestures in the mirror. For days ahead of time, I practiced looking sorry, level-headed, bright-eyed, and determined to succeed. I wanted to appear reformed, thoughtful, and eager to enter a crimeless future, and I thought my gestures would amplify my argument for release. My caseworker at the time, Mr. Wilcox, was preparing to retire, and it was his job to advise me on the prison procedures and generally keep an eye on my progress, but he slacked off and took no personal interest for me. And then during our first meeting, he actually fell asleep. On the day of my hearing, he was supposed to sit with me and tell the judge I was going to stay out of trouble, blah, 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 blah. But on that day, he called out sick, and I was alone. The panel was made up of 2 men and women in all middle age. They were flanked by the 3 guards by protection. One judge's name was Mr. Dove, which I thought was a good omen because of thinking I would soon be free as a bird. That was the wishful thinking. Once I sat down and crossed my hands on my lap and struck my remorseful, thoughtful, and bright-eyed pose, the woman looked up and asked what happened to the $10,000. Then I gave her a thoughtful look. "I spent it on my lawyer and gave the rest to my dad," I said, lying a little. "He needed it. Did you pay the tax on it?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I didn't know I had to." As she made a note, she said, "Ignorance to the law is not an excuse. Not paying federal taxes, is a federal offense. Perhaps when I'm released, I can get a job and I can pay the government," I suggested. "I'm willing to do that." She made a sour face. I looked at the 2 guys and freshened up my smile. Finally, one said, 2,000 pounds of hash is one of the biggest hash busts in the U.S. history. We'll have to take that into consideration." "Only 100 pounds was ever recovered," the other judge. "Where's the rest?" the woman asked with renewed annoyance. "They sold it," I said. "Who's they?" she asked. "The owners," I replied. "Hamilton and Rick. I just work for them." "We have no record of that," Mr. Dove said. "We have here that you sailed a boat with 1 ton of hashish into New York City and sold it. We want to know where the money is." "I only received $10,000, I said. The woman looked up and cocked her eyebrow at me. "That's your side of the story," she said harshly. "The prosecuting attorney claims that you were not very cooperative at the time of the sentencing, and I don't find you terribly cooperative right now." I didn't know how to respond. I had prepared to be contrite and sincere, not combative, and the few minutes I had make a good impression. We're all going to hell, and I could feel my composure unraveling. "Thank you," Mr. Dove said. "You'll be hearing from us." I stood up. I felt insane from having absolutely no control over my fate. I left the room, and the moment I returned to my cell, I worked my face over. 3 weeks later, I received a letter announcing that I had a 2-year set-off until seeing them again. That was hard to take. 2 years before I could see them again, and there was nothing I could do but take it. Others got their set-off letters, too. Soon a guy came up in the hallway and said, "Give me a list of the drug dealers you know, and I'll give you a list of the ones I know, and then we'll make each other a deal and snitch out for the feds." "I've been hearing the scam all week," I said. "You're the 5th guy who said that. You gotta come up with a better idea." This kind of thing happened all the time. They got the ideas, but their desperation just made them dangerous. Because the skin on my face was so messed up, it was difficult to shave properly, so my face shaving became an exercise in landscaping. As if I was shaving around flower beds and trees and rocky outcroppings. I could never get a close, even shave, and after a while began to manipulate my face as if I were a makeup artist, getting myself ready to be filmed for some role as a psychotic or hardened criminal. There was grooming rules in prison. I wasn't allowed to alter my appearance so radically that it seemed I was preparing to disguise myself for an escape. I couldn't do anything permanent like carve killer on my forehead and wait for it to scar. No facial tattoos, no head shavings, no beards, no raging acne. But raging acne, facial tattoos, raging acne, mustaches, and elaborate sideburns were acceptable. For a time, I looked like an unevenly trimmed topiary, but gradually, as I got used to my new life, my skin settled down and I regained my face. From my new cell window, I could see a line of houses at the distance. As the months passed, I watched people celebrate lives, Easter, Memorial Day, Independence Day, Labor Day. In October, I watched them put up Halloween decorations, and we didn't celebrate Halloween in prison, or I should say, every day in prison was scarier than any Halloween, so there was no reason to do anything special on October 31st. But thinking of Halloween reminded me of a funny story from when I was in 5th grade. We lived in Kendall, Florida, right on the train tracks. One Halloween afternoon, a police car flooded our neighborhood and announced that Halloween was canceled because there had been a prison break upstate at Radford. A couple of guys had hopped a freight, and the cops thought they were jumped in off in our area. We locked our doors and turned off the lights. We pulled the curtains, and all night I scampered from window to window, peeking out, looking for unshaven, suspicious types in striped outfits. Every time I brush rustled in the wind, my heart leapt. I saw rugged prison mugs in every shadow. It was the most exciting Halloween ever. 3 escapees caught not far from our house, and I was disappointed that I had spotted them slinking around. The memory of my youth was such a surprising relief from all the hatred and despair, blood and drugs that surrounded me. From then on, I kept looking out my cell window, and from time to time, it seemed I could see into the past and amuse myself with stories about my family and old friends. I wrote these stories down in my prison journal, and it gave me a lot of pleasure to recall my childhood.